on a Saturday morning to the final panel of the School of Data Journalism. This is the second edition of the School of Data Journalism. We were here last year again. We're here for the second time talking about how data journalism has come on in the past year. This is kind of not only the final panel, but the penultimate session. The final session that we've got today is at 2 o'clock in Hotel San Gallo, and it's hands-on visualization techniques with Gregor Aish. So I'd really encourage you to come and to also get there early, because yesterday we also had a visualization session and people were sat on the floor and it was absolutely full. So if you would like to join us for that one, make sure you get there early. A couple of words very quickly about the school in general. The school is organised by two organisations, obviously with the help of the International Journalism Festival. My name is Lucy Chambers and I work for the Open Knowledge Foundation. We are an organisation that works on both the supply and demand side of open data. So we work with organisations like governments, like scientists, cultural institutions, to help them open up data. And then my job is to work on the demand side. So I work with people like NGOs, journalists, hence events like this, to help them actually use it once it's there, because there's not an awful lot of good if you open up all of the information and nobody actually uses it. So the Open Knowledge Foundation has a new initiative, relatively new initiative, and it's called the School of Data. You can find it online at schoolofdata.org, where we're going to be publishing material after this, after all of the sessions. So if you miss them, you can find them both on schoolofdata.org and on the website that Liliana runs as well. She'll tell you about that very shortly, datadrivenjournalism.net. And so if you miss it, or you can't follow along, or you want links or anything like that, they will all be there. Liliana's done a fantastic overview post with all of the links combined into it. One final piece of logistics: we do have a hashtag for this event, and that is #DDJSchool. So can we have the slide back up? #DDJSchool. And so if on the off chance that you can connect to the internet in this room, and you would like to tweet, please do at that, because we'll be kind of collecting tweets, and if you have any feedback or anything, you can tweet that at us as well. So I'm just going to hand over to Liliana, who's going to introduce the European Journalism Centre and also the panel.
Good morning, everyone. I am Liliana Boonegru. I lead data journalism activities at the European Journalism Centre, and I'll tell you a few words about the centre. We are a non-profit organization based in Brussels and Maastricht, and we aim to help journalists do their job better through trainings, online resources, and building communities. In the area of data journalism, we run a website that maps developments in the field called datadrivenjournalism.net. Last year, we published a manual together with the Open Knowledge Foundation called the Data Journalism Handbook. And we also have a mailing list that has around 1,000 members right now, where people interested in this topic, can ask questions and exchange knowledge. We also run an initiative called Emergency Journalism, which is where the topic of the panel of today comes from. Rina Tsubaki, who is our moderator today, is running this session that aims to provide journalists with tools, case studies, and other resources to help them cover situations of crisis and emergencies. Before I hand over to Rina, if we could have the slide up again, please. Just to, so if you've missed all the other sessions, Lucy already mentioned this, but if you've missed all the other sessions, all the links and the recordings from all the 6 sessions that we have so far will be available on the Journalism Festival website and on schoolofdata.org and datadrivenjournalism.net. I'll now hand over to Rina to start the session.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's very early in the morning, but I think we will have a very interesting discussion today. Our session at the School of Data Journalism today will focus a little bit different, we will have a different angle. We will be talking about covering emergencies in the age of big data. By emergency, we mean two different things. Both natural disasters, such as hurricanes, earthquakes, floodings. Of course, in Italy, we have a lot of earthquakes here, but also man-made disasters, such as shootings, riots, political uprisings, whether they are large or small scale. We are going to focus particularly on the emergency situation, which threatens human lives, where people need information to take action. So, as everyone knows, last week we witnessed a number of both man-made and natural disasters in the world. Boston Marathon bombings, obviously, but also a lot of mass killings in Syria, Nigeria, and an earthquake in Sichuan region in China. So today's panel discussion focuses on four different things. One of them is the role of journalists in the humanitarian emergencies. What are the lessons learned from the past emergencies, past humanitarian crises? How to best monitor, verify, and curate crowdsourced contents and debates on the social media? How can technology support the process of monitoring and verification? And since we have a representative from UNHCR, we would like to talk about also about the cooperation, how to best cooperate with each other when we are confronted with these kind of situations. So we have a great leading journalists and the experts on this panel. Anthony De Rosa, who's the social media editor at the Reuters. He was actively covering the Boston bombings last week. Aaron Pilhofer, who's the interactive news editor at the New York Times. And New York Times obviously have a very interesting angle to the live coverage, live blogging, and the live fact-checking. Also, Claire Waddle. It's great to have you too for the gender equality balance here on this panel. She's a director of news service at the Storyful, and she has been training journalists, professional journalists from BBC and Guardian and other media outlets on social media skills and verification methods. And then we have Christopher Riordan. He's a senior digital editor and writer from UNHCR, the refugee agency. And he just came back from his visit to Syrian refugee, Jordan and Lebanon. So maybe Anthony, you can sort of give us an overview of like the social media strategy at the Reuters and how you covered the Hurricane Sandy and also the Boston bombings.
Sure. Hi everyone, thanks for coming out so early. My role at Reuters primarily is to try to take in as much information I can from social media and disseminate that into the newsroom. It's not really a marketing platform for Reuters, it's more of a news dissemination platform. And we use Facebook, we use Twitter, we use Tumblr as sources of information about what people are seeing around big breaking events, and also to get feedback on what our reports are and what people think they can add to it, what they're seeing, what we're not seeing. We also use a lot of tools to look at massive amounts of data that exist on social media, Twitter probably being the easiest to mine for information. Tools like Topsy, there's a pro version called Topsy Pro that lets you do a little bit more to dig in and make very specific queries about information that you're looking to get more insight into. Topsy allows you to do a lot of the queries right on their interface. There's another one that we use called Data Sift, which is a little bit more of a raw feed of information and data that you'll then have to format, and we'll work with our data team to go in and format that data to do very specific things. In the past, some of the major social-driven data activities and projects that we've embarked on, looking at the effects of different natural disasters, earthquakes, Japan being one of the major unfortunate incidents that happened over the last several years, and taking information gathered through social, updates that people were posting, information about how they're affected by these natural disasters, and putting that in a visual format. And also just raw data that we're able to acquire either through observing or through different data services. One of the biggest projects that we embarked on, which wasn't a social project, but it was a major data project, was during the Olympics, and being able to take in a lot of information about what was going on with the games and then visualized it in different ways, and also the recent election in the U.S. We did a lot of polling working with a company called Ipsos, and we had a really interesting interactive tool which let you look at how different candidates were viewed or different parties were viewed based on the different issues that were out there. So how Republicans were viewed by people when it comes to gay marriage, or what people's views were about certain candidates when they were of a certain demographic background, whether they had certain income levels, or so you could basically go through this tool and run all different sorts of queries in real time and look at how the polling showed where they fell in different areas. And it turned out after all was said and done that we were given some praise for how accurate a lot of the polling turned out to be that we did. And most of that is due to the fact that the way that the data team is churning that data and taking away things that will make for less reliable results. And that's obviously above my pay grade. I'm not someone who works primarily as a data journalist, but there's certain things that I'm sure other people on this panel, people who primarily work as data journalists, can talk about, that the purity of the data is really the core of what allows you to present great information in a very easy to consume way. So I consider myself more a client and a consumer of data journalism, and I try to help be a producer of data journalism, giving ideas for what I'd like to put together, and act as a team member with other data journalists who really do the bulk of the work.
And how did you exactly cover the Boston bombings and also Hurricane Sandy?
Oh, sure. So when I cover big breaking events like the Boston bombing, what I'm doing is I'm taking in a lot more information that I'm putting back out. One of the major issues that we all found with Boston was that people, in this day and age, that we never before had so much firsthand information, and then other people taking firsthand information, and then hearing things secondhand, and there's a lot of rumor and speculation and people putting out things that aren't necessarily true. A lot of people listening to police scanner traffic, which isn't always accurate, and shouldn't be used as a way to disseminate information. So what I was doing is just kind of absorbing all of that, whether it's coming from primary sources or secondary sources or scanners, and just trying to figure out what's true, what's not. So you have to take it, then you have to follow up. You're making calls to the sheriff's office, to police stations, getting in touch with officials to corroborate what you're hearing and seeing through social media. So my approach has always been to be a little bit more slow and careful, and not just regurgitate everything that's floating around through these different channels that are available to us today. I do a lot more of my reporting on live blogs, because there's more room to give context and explain more about what I'm seeing, shoot down things that are getting a lot of pickup. I think this is more important now than ever before is if you're observing things that you believe not to be true, you have to explain why you think they're not true, and put caveats around not only what you're seeing, but and this might be controversial, but if you're seeing other organizations and news outlets putting out things that they're not fully explaining why they're reporting it, I think it's sort of your duty to, if they're getting a lot of pickup, to put more context around that, because they may not be explaining why they're saying that or what the source of that is, or maybe they're not saying that this isn't coming from a primary source that would definitely prove that information is true. So that's sort of what I was trying to do during the Boston bombing coverage. And in the future, I think I'll do a lot more of that, is observing what everyone is seeing and trying to clarify some of those reports so that everyone is better informed about what people are reporting on.
Thank you very much. Aaron, maybe you could give us some of the overview of the how New York Times is dealing with the digital media strategy, and also the Hurricane Sandy coverage.
Sure, yeah. So I'm going to talk, I have a presentation, so maybe we can flip that up. There it is. Awesome. Okay, so I'm Aaron Pilhofer. I'm the editor of Interactive News at the New York Times, and my team combines really three things: community, actually four things. I keep forgetting to say that. Community, so there's a comments desk, social media, and for the past 6 years, mostly we also have a team of data journalists / technologists. So we're capable of building essentially platforms, tools, things that kind of go beyond what our content management system is capable of providing. And that's really key when you're trying to cover a disaster, because what you want to do is not fit the content into some into a template. You want the template to fit the content. And that is what we are capable of doing. So I'll talk a little bit about what our strategy is for live coverage, and it covers kind of a swath of things. I'll talk a little bit about Sandy, I'll talk a little bit about Boston, but then I'll talk a lot about WNYC, and I'll tell you why when I get to that point. So our coverage, our sort of live strategy started with this, which is our Oscar ballot, believe it or not, or our Oscar dashboard. We've been doing this for 5 years, and what we wanted to build was a tool that was flexible, it supported sort of live blog functionality, but it allowed us to do a lot of things around it. So in this case, you can see we had live video streaming up on top. We had a related Twitter module that wasn't just a live Twitter feed, there was an actual kind of Q&A going on between Tony and David in the video and folks on social. We were bringing that sort of interplay onto the dashboard. In addition, on the right side, we had a sort of game that went with the Oscar dashboard. So you could fill out an Oscar ballot, you could come to the dashboard, and then it was personalized to you. You could see how you did, how many of these categories you got right, and yes, that is my ballot, and yes, I did terribly on Oscar night. I think I got about 8 right. Okay, so this has very little to do with disaster coverage, but I'm getting there, trust me. Getting a little more serious, here's a version of our dashboard for a presidential debate. Again, we had the live streaming video, we have the sort of live blog that complements the video that's kind of reacting to it, but below the video on the right-hand side, we were doing what we call live fact-checking. So during the course of a debate, readers could post questions like, oh my God, what did Obama just say? That doesn't make any sense to me. Can you please explain it? And in as close to real time as we could, we had a team of reporters kind of fielding those questions and then piping the answers back into the actual stream. So again, it was kind of a two-way interface that allowed us to make this a much more interactive experience. So now let's get to Sandy. Again, this is less interactive, but again, we're able to do things with this tool that our normal templates wouldn't allow. As we were planning for Sandy, you know, this was about a week before before the presidential election. So Sandy had some particularly bad timing. We had to pivot very quickly and decide how are we going to cover this major news event at the same time as we were preparing for an election. And we knew this was going to be a big event. Irene, the year before, turned out to be not as big a deal, but every prediction showed that Sandy was going to be a significant disaster. And so we decided to go with our sort of live approach again and adapted the dashboard to it. But this ended up being a slightly different and unusual approach for us in one key way. The thing you want to know as a member of the public, as somebody who's in the path of a hurricane, is what is going on right this minute? What do I need to know right now? And unfortunately, the sort of traditional approach to storytelling on the web does not lend itself to that. The way we'd normally cover an event like this would be to have what we call a lead-all. So you would write a story, it would be posted to the web, it might be just a few paragraphs, and then you would write through as you got more information and retop it, and then you would amend it. And there'd be a timestamp that would tell you this was updated 20 minutes ago, 30 minutes ago, whatever. But what it wouldn't do is tell you two things. What's the most important thing right now? And two, what's new? It's really hard to do that in a traditional sort of inverted pyramid style written narrative. So we made the decision, the Times I mean, we pitched this idea and the Times made the decision, I think correctly, that effectively our lead story should be this. So over the period of about 8 days, this was the lead of the website. And this is where we were sending people every single day to get the information they needed to know right now. And again, because we own this sort of platform, on the right side, we could do something like you see here. Now, I was going to pull this up and show it to you but I was just testing the internet. It's really slow, so we should just stick with this. But on the right side, we were able to give you some really key information about public services, subways, what's open, and so forth. So this is sort of, I think, our new approach to live coverage of these kinds of events, where we're not really doing traditional storytelling, we're adapting it to the situation. Here's Boston, another example. I don't have the Sandy homepage, but you can see here the representation. This is how this dashboard would be represented on the homepage. Again, speed is of the essence here. So we were, even on a page like the homepage, which is relatively slow to update, we can take a piece of that and then constantly pipe new stuff into it so that there's the freshest, most recent stuff right there front and center. And of course, we can't ignore other platforms. We have the same sort of thing for mobile. This again is kind of how this looked for Boston. Spinning forward, I think the most interesting thing for us here that we didn't do for Boston and Sandy, well, not necessarily Boston, but certainly for Sandy, is take advantage of the mobile platform and what its capabilities are. I think you could use the geolocation feature to push highly relevant content to people, to maybe push the same content but maybe sorted or prioritized in slightly different ways. I think that's something we're really interested in doing. We're also mindful that a lot of things that work on the web don't necessarily work in mobile. So we wrote a lot of sort of longer posts that were kind of featurey. That stinks on a phone, and you don't want that. On a phone, you want immediacy, and you want it right now. So those are the two things I think we're looking at going forward. We also did a number of infographics. We had a live hurricane tracker. This is something that they had built a few years ago, so readers could track this online. And then after the fact, Rena wanted me to talk about this. We went down and reported out all the people who were killed and plotted that on a map as well. This is a really, really, really good infographic. Now, I want to be clear about this. These two projects were not done by my team. We collaborate. There's actually two teams in the New York Times that do interactives, the graphics team and us. These are both the graphics desk, but we collaborate very closely. So let me talk about the competition. WNYC is a tiny, well, not tiny, but it's a relatively, compared to the New York Times, small radio newsroom in New York City. It's a public radio station, and they have a data journalism team of, right now, 4. At the time of Sandy, I believe it was 2. And they frankly kicked the crap out of us on Sandy. I am not ashamed to say that John Keefe, who runs that team, covered this storm better in some ways than we did. And that's really kind of the message I want to leave with you guys today, because my team is 37 people, and we got the snot beat out of us by a team of 2, okay? So if they can do that, you can too. So how did John Keefe approach this? He approached it similar to the way we did, but just asking some basic questions. Start with the basics. Put yourself in the position of the reader. What are the questions they're going to be asking themselves, and how can you address them? And this comes from, by the way, if you Google predicting questions, building answers, you'll find John's blog post on this about how they approach Sandy coverage. It's very interesting. And he also gives you very detailed instructions for how he built some of the things I'm going to show you. But those are the fundamental questions people are going to be asking themselves. And it's very simple from the journalist's point of view to say ahead of time, what are the questions people are going to want to know? So what did they build? They built a storm surge flood zone map. In other words, these are the areas where if you happen to live here, and you could put in your address in the upper right-hand corner and find where you are, and you would know whether you are in a highly flood-prone area, moderately flood-prone area, or that you're high enough that you're maybe relatively safe. They built this using Google Fusion tables, and I'll talk a little more about that in a minute. They built a map that showed which trains were operating and which ones were offline because they were underwater. They built a flood gauge watch. In other words, as the flood waters rose, a lot of these points on this map turned to yellow and red as it reached flood stage. So you could actually watch in real time where the flooding was happening. They built a transit tracker, and you might remember here our version of this, there on the right. Well, we stole this completely and unabashedly from John. They launched this before we did, and this was like, of course, right? People are going to want this. So I sent John an email and I said, by the way, your transit tracker is sheer genius and we're going to steal it, and I will credit you for it every time I speak. So consider him credited. They also built, and you can't see it here unfortunately, they also built their own version of a storm tracker. Now this is taking data that is freely available from NOAA and plotting it again using some pretty simple code on a Google map. Showing the path of the storm and the likely path of the storm, where the storm has been, where the eye of the storm is, and what its likely path is going to be. And they also built a flooding zone map here where this was after the fact, and this was after the flooding occurred to show you where everything was. So the message here, and that's my contact information if you want it, the message here is pretty simple. Prepare ahead of time. If you are not prepared and you haven't asked yourself those 5 or 7 questions, like what are the readers going to want to know, and you haven't gotten a playbook together for how you're going to cover a storm or a disaster like this, when it happens, that is too late. It is already too late. You do not want to be doing this stuff on deadline, and much of what you saw there, John started working on during Irene the year before. Again, ask questions, put yourself in the mindset of the reader. And I mean, yeah, right? No, duh. That seems really obvious. And it is. But if it were that obvious, we wouldn't be sitting at this panel today. We wouldn't get this wrong so many times. It's very hard to do that. So we need to start doing that. Think about alternative ways of telling the story. In our case, it was a live blog mixed with other content, the dashboard. Using the dashboard as your lead story. In John's case, it was a lot of maps. In some cases, maps tell the story way better than words do. And finally, do not be afraid, and this is where we get beat constantly, do not be afraid to use free tools, get it done, get it out, and get it done fast. And John will show you on his blog, if you look it up, everything he built pretty much by himself. All of those things I just showed you was pretty much built by himself. Maybe he had a little help. And John is not a programmer by background or training. He figured it out himself. So you can too, believe me. If John can figure it out, and if I can figure this stuff out, you can figure it out. And finally, use the channels available to you. We used social media, like Anthony was saying. We used our social channels, I think, pretty effectively through Sandy. We were working the Metro feed of our Metro Twitter feed really hard, getting information out there. And it was surprising to us how many people were actually turning to social to keep up on what's going on with the storm. So don't forget that as a tool. And I guess with that, there's my contact information if you have questions. And with that, I'll turn it over to Claire.
Lovely. Can I sneak over there? Yeah, sneaky way.
You don't have to even sneak.
What?
You need this?
Yes.
I can move.
I can move too.
Oh, it's okay.
Hello, everybody. Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here. My name is Claire Wardle. I'm from Storyful, and we are a social media news agency. We were started 3 years ago by Mark Little, who used to be a foreign correspondent. And we don't use data in the way that Aaron has just described. We think about big data as just the amount of social media content out there. So every minute, there are 72 hours of content uploaded to YouTube. Every minute, there are 100,000 tweets sent, and every minute, there are 700,000 pieces of content shared on Facebook. That's every minute. So what we do at Storyful is to scour all of those pieces of content to find the golden nuggets, because 99% of the stuff being shared is not useful for journalists. It's pictures of cats, it's pictures of babies, well, it is for BuzzFeed, but it's not the kind of golden moments. But, sorry, but there are moments that people happen to be there at the right time with a smartphone capturing breaking news footage. And that is, that's what news organizations need. So at Storyful, what we do is monitor those streams, and then we find the content and we verify. And we verify in very forensic ways to ensure that the person who's uploaded that footage is the person that they say they are, that they're in the location that they say they are, that this has been uploaded today, it is the event that they're talking about. And that takes time. So we verify, and then we provide that information back to newsrooms in the way that a wire service would, but specifically around social media content. So I'm going to talk about, let's find my presentation. Should we do that? Bing. So I'm going to talk about, again, like Aaron, 2 case studies. Firstly, the Hurricane Sandy case study, and then specifically around the Boston bombings. So one thing I want to say is that we work with news organizations, but we also work with the social platforms themselves. So YouTube is an incredible platform, but they're not necessarily very good at knowing what's real and what's not. So we work with them to surface the content that has been verified. So with them, they asked us to create a feed of verified videos from Hurricane Sandy that they could plot on their crisis map. So what's fascinating when you think about news coverage and disasters is the role that platforms like Google now play. Before you might think that it would be the New York Times that would create a people finder, but Google creates a people finder. So the role of platforms in these spaces are really interesting. So they had their crisis map and they said, could we put a layer of YouTube videos onto that map, only YouTube videos that you have verified? So that's what we did, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. Just quickly, I've got a video that I think is quite helpful in just seeing how we work. I'm not quite sure how it's going to work with the Wi-Fi, so let's give it, I don't think it's going to be positive.
Yeah, I know.
That's going to be bad. Okay, well, I might send around the link via the magic of Twitter, but basically just to talk through some of the examples. When these big storms happen, lots of people who upload are not citizen journalists. So there was incredible video of a huge tree falling that was filmed by this teenager standing at his back door, filming, like completely, seriously, dangerously. He was like, ooh, tree falling. And luckily the tree falls that way and not on his head. But we found the video because he just uploaded it to YouTube. He was a teenager. And we thought, this is a great video, but how do you find out who this guy is? So we had to search his username, cross-reference that with his Google Plus account, where he named his high school, then go to his high school and find that, and then plot on Google Maps where the tree fell and where the shed was and where the garden was. And all of this we do all the time on any piece of content. And Storyful has created its techniques via the Arab Spring. Because, of course, there's all this content coming from Syria, and at the beginning, when there were no journalists there, we had to find out how can we do this without being on the ground. And the same techniques work, whether it's Syria or whether it's the back garden of New Jersey. But what was fascinating is that the audience increasingly want to know what's been verified. So during Hurricane Sandy, there were a lot of sharks. You might remember there were lots of pictures emerged of sharks swimming in people's gardens. And there's some fun there. There were some fun blog posts that emerge around what's true, what's not. And some journalists themselves got caught out by retweeting pictures of, the classic Statue of Liberty with a big storm cloud. From disaster movies, pictures get taken from that. And there's a lot of journalists themselves who aren't good enough at saying, that's fake, I'm not going to share that. So I'm actually going to move on to Boston, because I think I've got more information to talk about in terms of what happened last week. In terms of big data, I talked about how much content there is out there. And so what we use at Storyful are Twitter lists. And everybody on our different Twitter lists has been hand verified. We put together those lists of people we know are on the ground, and they've been verified. They're often journalists, they're NGO workers, they're citizen journalists, they're people that we know and trust. And we are monitoring over 600 Twitter lists that are moving at all times. But we're using technology to say, when do any one of those lists start moving more quickly than the average? So a South Korea list, we know at any particular time of day or night how many tweets per minute there are. If that starts moving more quickly, an alert goes off in our newsroom to say something's happening in South Korea. Sometimes it's a soap opera storyline, and everybody's tweeting, car crash, death, kill. And it's not, it's because it's a soap opera storyline, it's not a news story. But 2/3 of the time, the alerts do actually relate to a story. So here's our list from Massachusetts, which we were relying on very heavily around the Boston bombings, because everybody on this list we knew, and we were hopeful that what they were saying was true. We still had to verify afterwards, but this was giving us a stream of information that we knew was probably true. Thing is, often in these news stories, you don't know the person who's going to upload that tweet that you really need. So you might know about Whitney Houston's death. A young girl tweeted about 2 hours before the news broke to say, my auntie works in a hotel, Whitney Houston is dead. But she had 30 followers, nobody knew her, it wasn't something that we'd found. So nobody has found the magic juice of finding those hidden tweets. And so I'm going to talk through how to find these kind of tweets. And there are new technologies, and one of them is Geophedia, that's getting a lot of talk at the moment. Geophedia is a way of looking at social content that's been uploaded from a specific area. So during the Boston Marathons, they opened up their feeds and people could use that. Now, only 4% of social content is geolocated. So Geophedia is only as good as the location you're working with. So with Boston, actually, it was relatively strong because quite a few people in the area were geolocating their tweets. A year ago, when we first tested Geophedia, we were looking at protests in Bangkok. There was nothing on Geophedia because nobody in Bangkok was geolocating their content. But if you looked on Twitter lists that we had for Thailand, there was lots of content. So none of these tools are perfect, and it's about working out which tool works for which story. But here's an example of a profile of a girl who you can see here. My mum was running in the marathon and saw one bomb go off. We got out of there ASAP, and thank goodness we are okay. Now, you can see here she has 36 followers. She's actually like a lot of Twitter users. She doesn't have a massive following base. She's just using it to talk occasionally. You can also see that she doesn't have her real name. She's just got Knight Neko. No address, no nothing. So you see this tweet and go, hooray! And then you go, oh no. Because you've actually got a lot of different steps to go through to find out whether this is true and who this person is. So this video you may have seen is, let's see if we can play this, only 14 seconds, I'm hopeful. You may have seen it, but this is because her mother was wearing a GoPro on her head. So people who say, social media, why are we playing with social media? That's not journalism. That's journalism, that's footage, that's breaking news footage. And you can see that that's now got over 3 million views. The audience are increasingly going to YouTube to find the witness accounts. The problem is there's nowhere on YouTube to tell you whether that's true or not. But that is a whole different panel discussion. But if I go back to the slides, I'm going to show you how we verified that particular video so that we could send that out to news organizations. So here's the clip. If we went to Google Street View, which is one of the biggest tools for using, whenever you find a photo or video, the first thing you should do is go to Google and place yourself in the position that somebody filmed that. And when you do that, you're a long way to saying, okay, I'm pretty certain that I've ticked the first box of verification. Because verification isn't black or white. Verification is a process around, okay, can we verify location, date, weather, metadata? There's 7 different steps to verification, and sometimes you say, we've said yes to 5 steps, but we don't know the last 2. Verification isn't black and white, it's a process. So here, we said yes, we feel pretty confident about the location because Google Street View, we've mapped the same place as she was when she ran past. Also, there was this picture that was taken by a journalist, Boston to a T. He took the same photo, and it was geolocated. You can see from the bottom, if you click that Boston, Massachusetts, it absolutely placed him in the right point on the map. It also had it time-stamped at exactly the right moment of the explosion. So we had that to cross-reference with her YouTube video. So again, we had more information to say this looks true. But we went back to this account to say, okay, we need to find this person. Now, Night 3, we couldn't find on any of the main social platforms. So we were starting to say, well, maybe this is just a fake, we're not really sure about it, until Pinterest came along. So I don't know how many people here use Pinterest, probably more women than men, but on Pinterest, you can see pinterest.com/Night 3. She's only got one board. She hasn't really used it, but she has used her real name. So now we know this is Morgan Tracy. So we've got something to go on, we've got a name. And so we think this is the daughter, because she's saying, my mum ran in the marathon. So at this point, we could have given up, but we said no. And we thought Boston Marathon is going to have a people tracker. So we went to the Boston Marathon real-time people tracker and typed in Tracy, and it popped up with Jennifer Tracy, and we could map where she was at a particular time during the race. So you can see here that we were looking at her pacing and working out from her pacing that, yes, she would have been at that point in the marathon at 2:50. So at this point, we're saying, okay, this looks like it's Jennifer Tracy, so, okay, we need to get hold of her, but we still need to check out who she is. Now, there's a website called Spokeo. For us who are Europeans, we're not used to sharing data. The Americans are brilliant at giving away their data. So Spokeo is this incredible website where you can basically find out the value of somebody's house, their telephone number, their age, whether they're married. It's amazing. I mean, terrible for privacy, amazing for journalism. So we put in Jennifer Tracy to Spokeo, and we got these 3 people who came up. And from there, we found the Jennifer Tracy that we needed. And there's a pro version of Spokeo that gives you, I've blacked out some of the information that I didn't want to make public. But we found her, and she's from Ballston Spa in upstate New York. So we were like, okay, we have more information about her. We found her LinkedIn profile, so we found out that she did work in health. So we thought maybe she's going to be a marathon runner. No, that's a leap. We're getting more and more information about her, and we're trying to find a telephone number. And we find Morgan Tracy's Facebook profile. So again, if this is you, you need to go back to your Facebook settings and shut everything down, because from Morgan's Facebook page, we went through her friends and found one of her friends was Gerard Quinn. And because he was a bit older, we thought he's probably a family member. So we went to Gerard Quinn's Facebook page and found that he had said, I'm so extremely proud of my niece, Jennifer, who is running the Boston Marathon today, and puts the Boston Marathon tracker in his post. So we said, okay, great. Gerard is the uncle, Morgan is the daughter, Jennifer is the mother, and we were able to contact the whole family and say, is this you? Can we use it? Are you okay? And they said, yes, here's permissions, and we were able to provide that to news organizations. But none of this comes quickly. That took 4 hours, that process of verification. But, you know, it's something that's really important. There was a lot of fake information going around, and Night 3, that Twitter account, looked false. You wouldn't have thought that that was a Twitter account that would have been useful. Ultimately, it happened to be a young girl. And that is many of the eyewitnesses. That's what their social profiles look like. It's not the stuff that's very easy to verify. So it just takes time. So I'd be happy to answer questions afterwards. But yeah, that's how we deal with big data at Storyful.
Thank you so much, Claire. We're going to go into more detail about the monitoring and the verification process later on. But before doing that, maybe Chris, if you could talk about... Yeah, that would be better. So we talked about the Boston bombings and Hurricane Sandy, but we now want to shift our focus to Syria, because that's another thing that happened last week, the turmoil. So maybe Chris...
Italian is not good. Can we switch this? There we are. Okay. So I'm Chris. I'm from UNHCR, which is the United Nations Refugee Agency. We're dealing with emergencies often in a different context than Boston or Sandy, which are very acute, and play out in a short period of time. We're working on emergencies that are slow and grinding and go on for years in many cases, although there are, spikes in when they get very dramatic. So what we do, we're a very operational organization. We do work on policy and advocacy, but most of our people are in the field, in very remote locations, on the front lines, in hotspots, places where a lot of journalists can't get anymore or can't get easily because of, budget reasons. So often our people are on the ground before the journalists get there, and we're trying to get them using social media more to be getting information out more in real time. But what I wanted to talk to you today about was mostly the Syria crisis. I just came back from Jordan and Lebanon, two of the countries that people are fleeing to from Syria. And when we think about refugees, we often think of something like this, the iconic image of the rows of white tents. And this is Zatri camp in Jordan, where I was last weekend. And the reality is a lot of refugees do live in situations like that, but actually 3/4 of the refugees around the world live in towns and cities. And that's also the case with this emergency. In Jordan, I think it's 76% are in towns and cities. In Lebanon, it's 100% because there are no camps. So data, or at least simple statistics like that, can help dispel misperceptions about what is a refugee, what does a refugee emergency look like. So in terms of data, we collect a lot of data. We're not yet at the big data stage, I think. We're still at the little data stage. But even so, there's a wealth of information there. And what I'm trying to do is get my hands on that, pull it out, find the meaning in it, and push that out, as well as getting some of the raw data and sharing that with partners at the New York Times, Al Jazeera, and elsewhere, because they have teams of data journalists who can do these brilliant data visualizations that we just don't have the skills and the capacity and the time to produce as quickly and as well as they can. This is a family I met on Monday in Amman. So they are, some of that 76% who are living in the urban situations. When we collect data, we used to do it, I'm told by colleagues 20 years ago, in Rwanda, it was a matter of head counts. And that was sort of the extent of the registration process in some ways. Now there's more need for accountability and transparency. There's also greater value put on data that can help us improve operations, work more efficiently. So now when we register people in the Syria crisis, for example, we're collecting a lot of information, names, dates of birth, religion, ethnicity, what their vulnerabilities are. And recently we tried to add some questions to the questionnaires so we could get more data. But in fact, what's happening is we're having to ask fewer questions because the time it takes to get people processed, the flood of people has come so quickly that people are waiting, days and weeks to be registered. And so for every extra minute we spend trying to ask more questions, it means people wait longer. So We gather a lot of this information, though, and we have a data portal where we share it. It used to be that much of this was done in PDF format, so it looked pretty, but the data was not very accessible for people outside. It's now being updated, so there's more Excel spreadsheets that are available, so data can be filtered and manipulated by journalists. There's also, the map is now becoming embeddable, so there's you can customize it and embed it on another site. And also there's an API that's being developed so that you can pull the data directly from the portal. Then just briefly I wanted to tell you about sort of a social media campaign that we did recently. The number of refugees from Syria, in December it was at about 500,000. Then suddenly in January it increased, February it just skyrocketed, and we realized all of a sudden that we were rapidly approaching 1 million. So we looked at, how can we, on the communication side, we've tried to move away from just the cold statistics that they become very repetitive, and you kind of lose the humanity of a refugee situation. It just becomes a mass of people who are far away and hard to relate to. So we've been trying to focus more and more on telling the individual stories. And yet, in this case, we thought that the 1 million was a very significant milestone and that we needed to tell that story, but we wanted to be able to break it down. So we looked about 2 days before we could pinpoint, we knew that in 2 days we were going to hit the million. So we had people in the field identify someone who was going to be registering on that day. And this is Bushra in Tripoli, in Lebanon. And so we picked her out. We didn't want to call her the 1 millionth because, there were many people who registered that day, and you can't say exactly one. But she was 1 in a million. And what we liked about that is that it helped indicate that there's 999,999 other stories to tell. This is one of them. So it worked both to tell the number of the story of the statistic, but also to personalize it. We did a quick video on social media about her that got 6,000 views within a day or two. And then we also did a quick, sort of simple infographic, not super sophisticated, not layers of, not a dynamic data visualization or anything, but drawing the comparisons with what 1 million means to what some of our audiences could relate to. So comparing it with populations in some of our target audience, the US, the UK, because we were focusing on some fundraising at that time. And then we had, Maroon 5 tweeted out pieces of this. Lise Doucette took pieces of this and used it in her piece on BBC. So we got a lot of mileage out of these statistics. So we're looking at how can we combine the data with the individual storytelling and present a fuller picture of the crisis. We also released a set of photographs that we had commissioned, sent a photographer, Brian Sokol, around the region, and he took photographs of people with the most important thing that they took with them when they fled. Because people often, in this situation, they take very little. This is a boy who took his cell phone, and what he liked about it is because there's a place where he can stand. There's a hill at the refugee camp at Zatri. They call it Syria Tel Hill, because from there you can pick up a signal from Syria, so he can make a local call back to his father, who's just across the border. We released this as well, and it was published on Al Jazeera, on CNN, on the BBC, in Foreign Policy magazine, and elsewhere. Excuse me. Now what we're doing is we're building a user-generated content piece around this for World Refugee Day, which is June 20th. So we'll be asking people, what would they take if they had to flee at a moment's notice? What would the most important thing be that they would take with them? And then they can upload a photo, and that will go onto a Pinterest board. So we're looking at how we can combine, the social media, the data, and the individual storytelling in a way that helps keep attention focused on these emergencies. The sad news is that we hit 1 million on March 6th. Today it's at 1.4 million. So in less than 8 weeks, we've had another 400,000. And the projections for looking forward for the rest of the year are extremely grave. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. Also, I think at the UNHCR, you are developing this database development project called PARC, where you can grab some of the official documents and the Excel sheet coming from the UN agencies. So that's something that maybe some of you are interested in taking a look at. But I want to go back to the sort of monitoring, verification, and also the, so that is the difficulty here is the discovery, isn't it? But how do we, especially when we are talking about the small newsrooms, how can we actually monitor this, because there's like streamline coming from the not only just Twitter and YouTube and all those social media contents, but also their official information coming through. What is the sort of like the practice? How do you monitor your newsrooms, maybe?
Oh, they took it over. I would go back to what Aaron said, and it's you use what's available to you, and you're not very, you don't worry too much about saying, this is ours, we're going to use this, and we're only going to use the stuff that we do in-house. His example of WNYC is perfect. We took the updates that WNYC was putting out, and some of them were embeddable. We embedded them directly into our live blog, or we linked to the pages that WNYC was producing and said, they're giving the best, most frequent updates. We're a global news organization. We don't focus so much on what's happening in New York City and don't have those incremental updates. These are the people you should be looking at for specific types of information. So don't feel like you have to own everything and be more of a direction, a person who can direct people to where to go to get information. And I think oftentimes organizations feel like they have to own and they have to produce everything themselves, and I don't think that's the case. I think you should be more of a beacon for where all the information is, to gather it, organize it, and tell people where to go.
I mean, nobody has solved this problem. So I don't know about you as journalists, but at Storyful, our journalists will have 3 or 4 screens. On each screen, they might have, 20 tabs open. On TweetDeck, they'll have 40 columns. I mean, there's no easy way of doing this other than just refining what you're doing and sharing. So we use Chrome profiles. So you can log in, and so if somebody has created a kind of a dashboard with all, for a breaking news story, these are the best Twitter lists, these are the best hashtags, and so then when the next person comes on shift, sharing that information, because I think in newsrooms we often reinvent the wheel every shift. And actually, we're not very good at passing on that information. But the person who creates the discovery dashboard, as newsrooms have relied on these content management systems like EMPS or different things. Now, journalists are having to rely increasingly on web-based tools, and nobody has brought them all together, and it makes it increasingly difficult for journalists to do this well. But I think it is a case of sharing knowledge. And I think social journalists are very good at sharing what they're finding. Like Anthony was saying, follow this feed, this is a great person on the ground in Boston, that kind of thing. It's incredible to see, I think, from social journalists who have stopped thinking of themselves as this is my black book. Which I think has helped, and I like the fact that you can get that knowledge from a Reuters journalist or a New York Times journalist, even if you're working for a small paper in Slovakia. We're all doing that in the social space, which I think is really exciting, but nobody has cracked monitoring properly. And the big monitoring tools, like, Radian 6 that's now been bought by Salesforce and Crimson Hexagon, and they're all incredible pieces of product. I mean, DataSift is another one, but they're actually very difficult to use, and it's often about monitoring in the past. So in the last 7 days, how many times did somebody mention my brand? Nobody has come up with a really good way of monitoring in real time what's being uploaded, and that's why the challenge is in numbers. Like our newsrooms, we have to use humans to do this, and it's taking a long time, mixed in with technology. But yeah, if anybody can build that, you'll be a millionaire times 10.
I have a question about the verification. Of course, last week, about during the Boston bombings, there was several leading media outlets wrongly reported about the 2 suspects in custody. And I read a paper, I think it was on the Neiman Lab, about that the journalists should reevaluate the importance of silence and timing. But being on the front line, that must be a tough issue. So what is your take on that? Maybe Anthony and also Aaron?
So I think the example you brought up was John King at CNN reporting that a lot of these journalists, I feel like they rely on their sources. They feel like they can trust certain sources. They've used them multiple times, and sometimes sources are going to burn you. And John happened to rely on a source who burned him in a very public, major situation, and it's unfortunate that that happened. And I think cable news is in a difficult position because they have to fill up a lot of time, and they're on the air, and they're constantly having to tell people new information. I feel like they're under pressure to give you something new all the time, and I sort of feel some empathy for people who are in that business. I think social media and the way that covering breaking events, you feel some of that pressure, but I don't feel like I have my boss over my shoulder saying, you got to get something new out. You have to do, you know, you have to break something or get a scoop. I feel like I feel lucky enough that I can take a little bit of a step back and do a little bit more verification and take my time and verify things that I'm seeing. I also feel like the access to so much information makes it more attractive to take that information and make it public. And that's something that I struggle with, is that I have to remind myself that although I can see all these things and I'm getting a lot of things that could be true and could be correct, I still need to do a little bit more reporting verification. Claire did a great presentation on the process and how long that can take. And it really is important. You may not get it to that conclusion as quickly as some of your colleagues, but you'll feel a lot better about it when you get to that point, because you'll have all that background and corroborating evidence to prove that your conclusion is exactly what you say it to be. And I think you want to be able to have all that. You want to be able to show your work if you're going to give someone information. And I think a lot of times people just put out, you know, this is what we know, and they don't tell you how they got there. And I feel like news consumers want, now that they see that there's all these mistakes being made, they want to see the work behind the conclusions that news organizations are coming to more and more.
So we talked about this a little bit at a panel yesterday on live blogging and elsewhere. I think more and more the Times' approach to breaking news events is to not worry so much about whether we're first. Because truly, in this day and age, a scoop online lasts about a nanosecond. The one example that continues to baffle me and really concern me, we broke a story about the Stuxnet virus that, it had we in fact confirmed that the US and Israel had been behind it, that it was deliberately planted, et cetera, et cetera. We put that on the web at, I think, 3 in the morning for reasons that I will not bore you with, all bad. And, by 6 a.m., the first link that was being shared with me and everyone else was a highly search engine optimized clip job by Ars Technica. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, but I'm saying that the scoop that you think is such a scoop just isn't. And the other side of that coin is what value the Times is truly bringing to these kinds of events, and that's trust. They're not coming to you for scoops. They're coming to you because they want to know what's right and what's wrong. And anyone who is following Twitter during the whole Boston manhunt and the marathon and all the mayhem, I had to set it aside. It was absolutely a cacophony of rumor, speculation, nonsense. It was absolutely it was impossible to follow and to take anything coherent out of. The journalism piece is what Claire was describing, the process of sifting through this morass of raw information and finding the things that are right. And that's what people are looking for. So we don't worry, I don't think, as much these days about being, a second and a half faster than the competition. And this is where I think CNN had a pretty rough outing, on in some other ways too, with the Supreme Court ruling on Obamacare, for example. as did Fox News. But you know, I think that's the approach that news organizations need to take.
So that brings up the sort of the dimension, the role of journalists as a curator, because there were a lot of rumors going on, speculations on Reddit, for example. Do journalists have to curate these social debates? Should they?
When you say curate the social debate, do you mean if some rumor starts to take on a life of its own and it gets propagated far and wide, should they acknowledge it? And
should the journalists intervene and tell them that this is not confirmed, for example?
I think once something gets a certain scale, it would be irresponsible not to address it and bring more clarity to it. And I think that role is becoming more important because people go to social media for their news before they go to traditional places like Reuters and the New York Times. So I feel like although we do our primary reporting on our websites, we have to realize that we should be able to bring clarity to people who aren't going there and are consuming news on social platforms. And if things are propagating there and start to become gospel, we need to go in and say, well, this is not true. This is not actually something that is rooted in fact, and bring evidence to show why we believe that these things are not true. So I actually do believe that that role is increasingly becoming more important. And a lot of people were suggesting, I had a conversation with Matthew Ingram, who's spoken on a number of panels here, that journalists should probably even start wading into Reddit threads and saying, no, this is not right. I mean, this information that you're passing around is incorrect. And although I think Reddit was very irresponsible in a lot of ways, it could also be a powerful platform if people who know what they're doing and understand how to verify pieces of media and things that are floating around, if they can go into these places where people are starting to get their information and start to become arbiters of what's truth and what's not in a professional capacity, platforms like Reddit could actually become more useful for verifying information and getting better veracity for what people are seeing.
Can I say something quickly? So people like to blame social media for circulating rumours. Humans love gossip and rumours. And in every village, everybody knows the gossip, and it might be the shopkeeper, and you go to the shopkeeper and you have a gossip, but you still go to church on Sunday to hear what the truth is. And I think that's the role of journalists, is that social media, people will go on there because they just want to see the gossip. But I remember in the summer of 2009, Michael Jackson died, and Twitter was full of saying, Michael Jackson's dead, but has the BBC said that Michael Jackson is dead? So they wanted to share the rumour, but at the same time they knew deep down, or would I need my dad to say whether it's true or not? And I think that we should stop blaming social media and just recognise that humans love gossip and rumour, and social media is just amplifying that. But there will always be roles for journalists because people still want to know what the truth is within all of that.
Well, just to slightly argue with you here, I don't think anybody's blaming social media, but I do think that there is this, I think there is in some respect a sort of a misunderstanding of what journalists actually do for a living. There are a lot of folks out there who believe, quite literally, that the job of the journalist is simply just a conduit. Information comes in, we type it up, and information goes out. And that is so not what we do. It is just not the role. Like 5% is what ends up in the newspaper or online or in the broadcast. The 90%, wait, does that add up? No, 95% is what Claire was describing, is this long, tedious, painful process of digging and digging and digging and digging until you finally can convince your editor that, I got it. And I think that you saw in this, particularly in the case of Reddit, around this Brown student who was, they took it upon themselves on Reddit to become, in their minds, journalists and got it 100% wrong in some really spectacularly bad ways. So I'm not blaming social media. I just think that we have to understand, and people who are doing this sort of thing have to understand that that's, sometimes that's actually not really, what we're doing day in and day out. And there are some real serious dangers in trying to do this in the way that the Reddit did and the rest. I mean, there's some real dangers in that. And I worry a little bit about this sort of almost like vigilante journalism that you see out there. Now, I'm going to come off, of course, sounding like the cranky old journalist when I say that, and I am so not that. But I really do look at the Reddit incident, this whole thing, and it really concerns me.
And some of the issue, we talked about Syria situation as well, and some of the issue that can come out also when covering the fragile situations, of course, censorship and the security issue. Of course, some of the, like Twitter, for example, selectively censor some of the contents according to the country, according to the legal sort of the setup. And but like you can always get around, but how do you actually reach those voices on the ground, and also how to deal with the censorship when covering the situation, like fragile situation? Maybe, well, I think you can comment, but maybe some of the journalists that we have here.
Yeah, I think I'm going to pass it to you because we're not actually, we're not covering that ourselves in that way.
Yeah, there's some like censorship, as in like, for example, like Twitter can censor some of the contents, right? But to discover, to reach out to the voices on the ground, because you're crowdsourcing.
I can speak to that a bit. All I can say is that people in these countries where they find it difficult to get information out often find ways to get it out regardless. And there are folks that are trying to help them do that through different tools, being able to use proxies. There's an application called Tor that people in places like Libya and Egypt and Bahrain and Syria, which is a way to get past the government censorship of the networks that they use, and use tunnels to get that information out to less totalitarian places that the information can then be spread throughout the world. But there's always the nuclear option, and we saw that in Egypt where they'll just shut the internet off, and they did that for a short period of time during a revolution in Egypt. And obviously everyone in other parts of the world said, well, you can't do that. And Egypt quickly turned the internet back on. There's always going to be people who have the motivation to figure out how to get that information out one way or another, and they're really smart people who know how to bend technology in ways that allow them to get that information out. And they work side by side. Journalists, oftentimes these are activists that are doing it. So when the information does get out, as a journalist, you have to remind yourself that this is coming from an activist's point of view, and it's coming through that prism. So you have to make sure that you're not just helping spread propaganda when you're getting information that comes through those channels. Sorry.
No, that's okay. So I also want to talk about the collaboration part, because everyone's doing the sort of verification process, whether they're journalists or humanitarian organization, whenever there's a humanitarian disasters. Could you share your point of view, how we could best cooperate among those different kinds of stakeholders? Maybe you can start, Chris.
Yeah, we work with journalists in a couple of different ways. One is we hire a lot of freelance journalists and photojournalists and videographers to gather content for us. So people who are on the ground or, to shoot video for us, to take photographs, to write stories. So there's that piece. Then in terms of the sharing of data, trying to get those raw data sets that we're allowed to share. And there are limits to this, and I meant to mention this earlier, but when we release the data, we have to make sure that we're not releasing data that's going to jeopardize any individual refugee, because there are reprisals. People can be tracked down. Bad things can happen. So we have to make sure that, people cannot be identified, and that sometimes, we have to strip the EXIF data out of photographs when we publish them sometimes, so that people can't use the geolocation or other details in order to find that person. There's also issues with releasing aggregate data publicly in a situation like Lebanon, where there's a delicate balance of different religious groups, and the political system is very tied to that. We have to be careful when releasing data about religion and ethnicity of the refugees who are coming in from Syria, that the public perception of that isn't going to, trigger some sort of political instability, because people will feel that, oh, there's too many from this ethnic group coming in. That said, we have released that, and to no ill effect, but we always have to look at these considerations of, will that data cause any danger? But just the same, we are trying to, I'm trying to get more and more of it out, because I think journalists can do brilliant things with it and tell the story in ways that we can't and reach audiences that we can't.
I'd like to ask, I would like to get some of the questions from the floor. Are there any questions? We have about 5 minutes left.
Everyone's so shy. Right over there.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Alice Klein from Radar, and was freelancing in East Africa. Just surprised in this talk that no one's really talked much about developing countries, because that's where a lot of the emergencies are really having the most impact, and that's where a lot of the big data comes from. I was interested, Aaron, that you were saying that when people were coming to the New York Times website, you had almost a responsibility to say, tell people where they should and shouldn't go, and that's the information that people needed. I was just wondering if any of you, perhaps, Chris, thought that there was space for something online, some kind of platform that journalists based in the West could use for, say, if we're talking about something like Haiti, where you can't be there on the ground in the first few hours, where you can kind of aggregate that kind of information. Because otherwise you just get a situation of like a Red Cross press officer getting 1 million calls from journalists all over the world. Surely if we've got all this technology, we can find a more effective way of collaborating and sharing that information, and not least because the aid agencies are notorious for not collaborating together, but like Claire says, maybe the journalists and the social media experts could be the ones to do that for them.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, a platform like that would be great, and I think one issue is sort of the verification, which gets at, what you're doing at Storyful, but sort of if some of those lists could be developed and verified, beforehand, that would be great. I don't know if Storify is able to do something like that, but
Storyful is, yes.
Yeah.
I don't know about
Or
Storyfy.
sorry, I'm not the first one to do that.
So there's another aspect to this, and that's tools, technologies, platforms, the ability to do these things, and that's where I think there's a real deficit. Paul Radu is in the audience right there. Raise your hand. Raise your hand. There he is. Okay. So he's been working very hard with a group of folks to develop a collaboration platform that is secure. It provides sources the comfort that they're not going. That if there's information on your computer, it's not going to fall into the wrong hands. That you're not, doing things that journalists do that just still boggle the mind, like dealing with confidential sources through Gmail, things like that. That you just like, what are you doing? That to me is where I think there could be avenues for collaboration that go well beyond what we have right now. You're seeing some of it happen, but I think you could do a whole lot more to kind of surface some of the things that you're talking about.
My question's kind of related to the previous one. How do you work with the local media in countries where there are emergencies? Because obviously here we're talking about the Twitter feeds, but in many countries, obviously few journalists or few even citizens use these tools. And I spent quite some time in Haiti after the earthquake. And actually I worked with some local journalists, and the thing that struck me most was some kind of frustration from all local medias. Sometimes there are many African countries, lots of local radios that cover the territory very, very well, but they've not been listened to in a way. So do you have kind of strategies to get in touch directly with this type of media locally?
Just to talk very quickly, absolutely, it's around knowing your patch. So, for example, in Congo, the rebels in Congo share a lot of things on Facebook. So for every country, you need to know where people are sharing and also who they are. And I think one of the earthquakes, I can't remember now in South America, but there was a local radio station that had the most incredible pictures that they were uploading to Facebook. So it's a case at Storyful, I think, for every newsroom now, knowing that for every city as well as country, knowing, yes, the stringers, yes, the freelancers, but also who the local media are, many of whom are very expert on social media, are uploading to YouTube and Facebook really incredible content, but it's very easy for us to think in a very traditional sense of, oh, pick up the phone, who's the stringer in that area, as opposed to who's the local journalist who's telling the stories to their communities incredibly well. So, I mean, I think there needs to be a better job of us thinking about ways of surfacing all of that and sharing it and creating, not directories, but something that allows a very easy search mechanism to say on the ground. And that goes back to verification. I need to know before the earthquake hits who on the ground is coming from a trustworthy source, or maybe not, maybe they are an activist group, which is fine as long as you know that they're an activist group. So if you're doing the immediate search after an earthquake and somebody's sharing lots but you don't know their background, you're on the back foot. So it's a case of knowing beforehand globally who the best people are. Yeah, and it's a big piece of work, but we should be doing it.
Yeah, and when you get led to one path, it often leads you to other paths. So a journalist in a very small location, if they're savvy, sometimes I'll get lucky and they create Twitter lists. So then I get to tap into the network that they've built of the people in that local area. So I didn't just find one person, I found another additional 10 people through looking at the profile of that person and then oftentimes I'll go to Storyful to see what lists they're building, and then I'll go through the people on their lists and look at the lists that those people on the list have built. So you can kind of be led down paths that'll take you further and give you even more sources in addition to the one you've already discovered.
But unfortunately, it's very Twitter-based. We need, there's so many places that Twitter just isn't the platform of choice. So that's where we need to do more work.
I think time is up. I'd like to thank you, all the panelists, for joining us today, and also the many people who are coming here. It was very early morning session today. For more information about the emergency and covering the emergencies, and we have this initiative called Emergency Journalism. So please check the website and follow us there. So thank you very much.
On a Saturday morning to the final panel of the School of Data Journalism. This is the second edition of the School of Data Journalism. We were here last year. Again, we're here for the second time talking about how data journalism has come on in the past year. This is kind of not only the final panel, but the penultimate session. The final session that we've got today is at 2 o'clock in Hotel San Gallo, and it's hands-on visualization techniques with Gregor Aish. So I'd really encourage you to come and to also get there early, because yesterday we also had a visualization session and people were sat on the floor and it was absolutely full. So if you would like to join us for that one, make sure you get there early. A couple of words very quickly about the school in general. The school is organised by two organisations, obviously with the help of the International Journalism Festival. My name is Lucy Chambers and I work for the Open Knowledge Foundation. We are an organisation that works on both the supply and demand side of open data. So we work with organisations like governments, like scientists, cultural institutions, to help them open up data. And then my job is to work on the demand side. So I work with people like NGOs, journalists, hence events like this, to help them actually use it once it's there, because there's not an awful lot of good if you open up all of the information and nobody actually uses it. So the Open Knowledge Foundation has a new initiative, relatively new initiative, and it's called the School of Data. You can find it online at schoolofdata.org, where we're going to be publishing material after this, after all of the sessions. So if you miss them, you can find them both on schoolofdata.org and on the website that Liliana runs as well. She'll tell you about that very shortly, datadrivenjournalism.net. And so if you miss it, or you can't follow along, or you want links or anything like that, they will all be there. Liliana's done a fantastic overview post with all of the links combined into it.
Also, Claire Wardle. It's great to have you for the gender equality balance here on this panel. She's a director of news service at the Storyful, and she has been training journalists, professional journalists from BBC and Guardian and other media outlets on social media skills and verification methods. And then we have Christopher Reardon. He's a senior digital editor and writer from UNHCR, the refugee agency. And he just came back from his visit to Syrian refugee, Jordan and Lebanon. So maybe Anthony, you can sort of give us an overview of like the social media strategy at Reuters and how you covered the Hurricane Sandy and also the Boston bombings.
Sure. Hi everyone, thanks for coming out so early. My role at Reuters primarily is to try to take in as much information I can from social media and disseminate that into the newsroom. It's not really a marketing platform for Reuters, it's more of a news dissemination platform. And we use Facebook, we use Twitter, we use Tumblr as sources of information about what people are seeing around big breaking events, and also to get feedback on what our reports are and what people think they can add to it, what they're seeing, what we're not seeing. We also use a lot of tools to look at massive amounts of data that exist on social media, Twitter probably being the easiest to mine for information. Tools like Topsy, there's a pro version called Topsy Pro that lets you do a little bit more to dig in and make very specific queries about information that you're looking to get more insight into. Topsy allows you to do a lot of the queries right on their interface. There's another one that we use called Data Sift, which is a little bit more of a raw feed of information and data that you'll then have to format, and we'll work with our...
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's very early in the morning, but I think we will have a very interesting discussion today. Our session at the School of Data Journalism today will focus a little bit different, we will have a different angle. We will be talking about covering emergencies in the age of big data. By emergency, we mean two different things. Both natural disasters, such as hurricanes, earthquakes, floodings. Of course, in Italy, we have a lot of earthquakes here, but also man-made disasters, such as shootings, riots, political uprisings, whether they are large or small scale. We are going to focus particularly on the emergency situation, which threatens human lives, where people need information to take action. So, as everyone knows, last week we witnessed a number of both man-made and natural disasters in the world. Boston Marathon bombings, obviously, but also a lot of mass killings in Syria, Nigeria, and an earthquake in Sichuan region in China. So today's panel discussion focuses on four different things. One of them is the role of journalists in the humanitarian emergencies. What are the lessons learned from the past emergencies, past humanitarian crises? How to best monitor, verify, and curate crowdsourced contents and debates on the social media? How can technology support the process of monitoring and verification. And since we have a representative from UNHCR, we would like to talk about also about the cooperation, how to best cooperate with each other when we are confronted with these kind of situations. So we have a great leading journalists and the experts on this panel. Anthony De Rosa, who's the social media editor at the Reuters. He was actively covering the Boston bombings last week. Aaron Pilhofer, who's the interactive news editor at the New York Times. And New York Times obviously have a very interesting angle to the live coverage, live blogging and the live fact-checking.
One final piece of logistics. We do have a hashtag for this event, and that is #DDJSchool. So can we have the slide back up? #DDJSchool. And so if on the off chance that you can connect to the internet in this room and you would like to tweet, please do at that, because we'll be kind of collecting tweets, and if you have any feedback or anything, you can tweet that at us as well. So I'm just going to hand over to Liliana, who's going to introduce the European Journalism Centre and also the panel.
Good morning, everyone. I am Liliana Boonegru. I lead data journalism activities at the European Journalism Centre, and I'll tell you a few words about the centre. We are a non-profit organization based in Brussels and Maastricht, and we aim to help journalists do their job better through trainings, online resources, and building communities. In the area of data journalism, we run a website that maps developments in the field called datadrivenjournalism.net. Last year, we published a manual together with the Open Knowledge Foundation called the Data Journalism Handbook. And we also have a mailing list that has around 1,000 members right now, where people interested in this topic can ask questions and exchange knowledge. We also run an initiative called Emergency Journalism, which is where the topic of the panel of today comes from. Rina Tsubaki, who is our moderator today, is running this session that aims to provide journalists with tools, case studies, and other resources to help them cover situations of crisis and emergencies. Before I hand over to Rina, if we could have the slide up again, please. Just to, so if you've missed all the other sessions, Lucy already mentioned this, but if you've missed all the other sessions, all the links and the recordings from all the 6 sessions that we have so far will be available on the Journalism Festival website and on schoolofdata.org and datadrivenjournalism.net. I'll now hand over to Rina to start this session.
Data team to go in and format that data to do very specific things. In the past, some of the major social-driven data activities and projects that we embarked on, looking at the effects of different natural disasters, earthquakes, Japan being one of the major unfortunate incidents that happened over the last several years, and taking information gathered through social updates that people were posting, information about how they're affected by these natural disasters, and putting that in a visual format. And also just raw data that we're able to acquire either through observing or through different data services. One of the biggest projects that we embarked on, which wasn't a social project, but it was a major data project, was during the Olympics, and being able to take in a lot of information about what was going on with the games and then visualized it in different ways, and also the recent election in the US. We did a lot of polling working with a company called Ipsos, and we had a really interesting interactive tool which let you look at how different candidates were viewed or different parties were viewed based on the different issues that were out there. So how Republicans were viewed by people when it comes to gay marriage or what people's views were about certain candidates when they were of a certain demographic background, whether they had certain income levels, or so you could basically go through this tool and run all different sorts of queries in real time and look at how the polling showed where they fell in different areas. And it turned out after all was said and done that we were given some praise for how accurate a lot of the polling turned out to be that we did. And most of that is due to the fact that the way that the data team is churning that data and taking away things that will